All right, welcome to George Washington's presidency. George Washington is elected and starts his service on April 30th, 1789. He's from Virginia and he was inaugurated on this day. It's since been moved forward. The inauguration happens around the 20th of January. John Adams is the vice president. And by the way, John Adams hated being vice president. It was a step away from the most important job in the world, and it was a long way from the most important job in the world. The vice president, he felt, did nothing, and he kind of made everybody miserable complaining about it. George Washington sets many precedents. Precedent is an example that becomes standard practice, and I've mentioned this before, I'll probably say it again, is that you could serve as long as you wanted to as president, as long as you could keep being reelected. Washington, however, sets a precedent and he steps down after 2 terms or 8 years. And that precedent would be followed until World War II, when Franklin D. Roosevelt serves 4 terms, dies in his 4th term. And then they decide to pass the 22nd Amendment to stop presidents from doing that. And so just about everything Washington does sets an example or a precedent. The first thing they need to do is set up the court system. So they passed the Federal Judiciary Act of 1789. It creates an independent from the state courts, federal court system with the Supreme Court at the top. Here's the outside of the Supreme Court. At that time, it had a Chief Justice and 5 Associate Justices. Now we have a Chief Justice and 8 Associate Justices for a total of 9. John Jay, who had helped write the Federalist Papers, is appointed as the first Chief Justice. Here's the inside of the Supreme Court. They don't meet in this room anymore. It's the old chamber, and then there's John Jay, the man himself. Okay, a presidential cabinet. Those are the people who help the president make policies and decisions. He can't be expected to do everything and be an expert on everything. So they help him create policy. The first one is the Secretary of War, now called the Secretary of Defense. Henry Knox oversees the nation's defenses. By the way, this is probably the best presidential cabinet ever. The second is the Secretary of State. It's Thomas Jefferson, and he oversees the relationships between the United States and the other countries around the world. Today, the Secretary of State travels like constantly. It'd be a horrible job. Secretary of Treasury is Alexander Hamilton, who manages the economic policy of the United States to make sure things are on stable footing. And then lastly, the Attorney General, Edmund Randolph. He advises the government on legal matters. Hamilton's financial plan. So Hamilton believed that the federal government should be stronger than state governments, and he sets out to give the United States broad economic powers that will help the federal government basically function. And so we have this really complex problem. During the American Revolution, there was no strong central government, and many of the states and even private citizens had loaned money to the United States government. Many other countries had loaned money, and so there was a lot of war debt. I believe it's about $90 million, and so they owe a lot of money. And many of those states issued what are called bonds. So a bond is, I go down and I basically give the government, let's say 100 ringgit, and the government says, well, come back in 10 years and we'll give you 125 ringgit. Sounds like a great deal. I make a 25% profit, and all I have to do is wait 10 years. But in the meantime, the government gets a bunch of money because like everybody in the country goes down and puts 100 ringgit in. And so that's what had happened during the American Revolution. Problem is, so what he wants to do is that bonds during the Revolutionary War, that you would bring those in and say, hey, I know this is from the state of Massachusetts, but I want to turn it into a federal bond. I want to turn it into the new United States government will be behind this, not the state of Massachusetts. And so they would basically replace all the bonds that hadn't been paid off. But the problem was that a state, and we're looking at you, Virginia, what if you'd already paid off your debts? Well, you didn't really want this assumption. You'd been good with your money, and you had paid off these bonds that you had issued during the war, and so you don't want this plan. So really what kind of happens is that there's a couple reasons for this. Let me do those, and then we'll kind of talk about what happens. It would cement states to the national government. So it kind of put like Massachusetts in debt because they had a large debt. But the states with no debt are kind of like against this. And so it really breaks into a North and South issue. And the compromise is that assumption does happen. The United States government takes on all those bonds, and the South gets to choose where they're going to have the national capital. And so they put it in between. If you go back to your southern colonies, they put it on land that is donated by the government of Virginia and Maryland. So it's between two southern states, and they start building the town of Washington, D.C. So the third thing they're going to do is raise the federal government's revenues, and revenue is money coming in through taxes and tariffs. And a reminder, is a tax on imported goods. Continuing on, these will encourage the growth of American industry. You're going to want to buy American made. They can put high tariffs on goods coming into the country, and you know, instead of buying British made goods or French made goods, you're going to be encouraged to buy American made goods. And then all that money goes in and helps fund the government. He wants to start a thing called the Bank of the United States. It's going to be like the storehouse for the government's money. It can make loans to businesses. It'll issue paper currency, and we won't have that problem that they had during the Articles of Confederation, where how much is a dollar from New York worth, how much is a Massachusetts 50-cent piece worth. And also it gives broad powers to the federal government. This then leads to the problem of like, how do you interpret the Constitution? And so Jefferson and Madison say, we want a very strict construction of the Constitution. If it says you can do it in the Constitution, well, then the government can do it. And it says nothing about making a national bank. A loose construction says that there's this elastic clause. The Constitution the government can do whatever is necessary and proper to make the country run well. And so Hamilton and Adams favor that. Again, in the end, all of this is settled. He gets his Bank of the United States. He gets the economic plan that he wants, but he has to give up the capital, and it goes into the South. Let's move our eyes to foreign affairs. In Jay's Treaty in 1794, Britain says they'll remove forts, which they're supposed to do at the end of the Revolutionary War. They'll pay for the ships. They'll pay for, if America will pay for some of the debts that the Tories had run up. And so really there's this, we're trying to like resolve issues that still linger from the American Revolution. And there was an issue going on called impressment, where British ships would stop American ships. They would go on board, and they would say, oh, look, there's some British sailors on board here. You need to be serving in the British military. Join the Navy now. And it was making Americans really angry, and it was not solved by this. So Jay is pretty much hated. Here he is hung in effigy. And so this is the treaty. Doesn't solve anything. It's going to lead to the War of 1812 eventually. Dealing with Native Americans, the Battle of Fallen Timbers is a victory over like a loose confederation of tribes of Indians in the Northwest Territory. And then the Treaty of Greenville, basically those tribes are forced to give tons of land to the United States government. The Whiskey Rebellion is a domestic issue that happens in Pennsylvania. There had been a pretty high tax put on whiskey, and so the farmers rebel. Washington jumps on the horse, rides out at the front of the army, and he said, before he even gets there, all the farmers run away and say, we don't really want to fight a battle over this. And so it is the government, the federal government, which was powerless to stop anything during Shays' Rebellion, acting, and they're showing that they have power, and they're ensuring domestic tranquility, which is promised in the preamble to the Constitution. Let's talk about the rise of political parties. The Federalists, which are Hamilton and Adams, they want that loose construction or loose interpretation of the Constitution. They trust the elite. They see the future of America as manufacturing and commerce. They want to get back in good with the British and trade with them, and so find ways to be supportive of the British. They want that strong central government. They want a high tariff. They want to use that tariff to improve the roads and some of the things, businesses of the United States. They want the Bank of the United States, and they want to build an army and a navy. The Democratic Republicans are Jefferson and Madison, and so they trust the common man. They're like, farmers are the best people in the world. They want an economy based on agriculture. They think the farmer, again, the yeoman farmer is like Jefferson's, favorite guy in all the world. They're really pro-French. Jefferson was not at the Constitutional Convention because he was serving in France, and he really wants us to support the French. They want states' rights so that the state has more power than the federal government, or at least a lot of power against the federal government. They want a low tariff, and they don't really want to try to improve the roads and things like that, canals, bridges. They're very much afraid of the Bank of the United States, and they do not want to have a permanent army. They don't want to spend money on it. They want to have as little money going out as possible. The French Revolution breaks out in 1789, about the time that Washington is elected. And so the French had helped us out during the American Revolution, and a lot of Americans, including Jefferson, are like, hey, let's help out. And Washington says, nah, we're not going to do anything. We're just going to let them fight it out. The French Revolution was also extremely violent. The poor rose up and slaughtered thousands of rich people. And so there was also this problem of the violence of it all. It wasn't a peaceful revolution. This is King Louis XVI, and this is King Louis XVI's head. Again, they slaughtered a lot of elites. Pinckney's Treaty is signed with Spain. Remember, they had taken over the Louisiana Territory after the French and Indian War, and so they're kind of our neighbors on the Mississippi River, and so the United States has access to the Mississippi River through Pinckney's Treaty and can use the port of New Orleans. At the end, as we talked about, he retires. And he steps down after 2 terms. In his farewell address, which is super famous, he says that you need to avoid the political party fighting. Don't get into all of that. I think it was kind of just dreaming because it was already pretty much, on. It was already happening. And then he says this famous part about avoid foreign entanglements. We don't want to be involved in European wars. We don't involve in European affairs. Stay looking at what's happening at home. And here's a quote: "The nation which indulges toward another nation an habitual hatred or an habitual fondness is in some degree a slave. It is a slave to its animosity or its affection, either which is sufficient to lead it astray from its duty and interest." And basically, hey, if you form an alliance with France, you're kind of slave to that alliance. You need to stay out of all of that. So that's George Washington's presidency.